Welcome back to Car-Pinionated, our weekly show on cars, the car industry, and driving in general, and some opinions thrown in the middle somewhere. I'm Doug Stewart, Senior Digital Content Producer at Fox 61 in Hartford, and with me is my friend Glenn Packman, um, who is improv comedy stylist of renown, multi-state
True.
comedy stylist, and my friend of 30 plus years.
Right.
Uh, Glenn, I wanted to talk this week about cars that are underrated,
Yes.
cars that don't get their proper due in the history of cars, or even the micro history of cars. Um, or were just underappreciated at the time and probably were ahead of their time.
Right.
And why don't you start us off?
I'm going to start off with something current, and I'm gonna paint with a pretty broad stroke here. Uh, I think currently, although this goes back also decades, I'm just going to say that the entire line of Mazda vehicles has never really gotten the credit they deserve. Unless you're Car and Driver magazine, which has always been a fan of Mazda, and for a good
Yeah,
reason, I think. But and even today, Mazda puts out an incredibly good line of vehicles that just don't seem to capture people's attention. I don't know why. They're beautiful cars. They're well put together. They're really fantastic to drive. I remember you having driven a CX-5 and saying that the mechanisms in the car almost felt like jewels, that they were
yeah,
like
Jewel like, yep.
jewel-like and smooth. And you know what? That's Mazda all over.
Mhm.
I've talked about this car in the past. Previously, I had a 1993 Mazda Protege LX, which is your Toyota Corolla Honda Civic class car.
Mhm.
Just it was an economy car. It was the best car I could afford at the time. It wasn't anything special. What an amazing car. Just did everything really, really, really well. And I drove that car over 100,000 miles, and I've been impressed with Mazda ever since. So just,
Mhm.
so I'm going to paint a very broad stroke, and that includes their current lineup in spades, because they have
Yeah,
some really good cars right now. If you're not
with that one tiny glaring exception of the three hatchback.
the three hatchback, that's just a styling thing. And
Yeah,
if you're interested, the three sedan just fixes that
yeah,
completely, and then
yeah,
some. Yeah,
right.
the three hatchback doesn't quite
No,
look right. And
I think.
Mazda's had a couple of clunks along the way, but for the most part, it's been terrific cars.
Mhm.
They just so that's my very broad stroke. And they continue to do it, and they continue to just not be noticed as much as Toyota and Honda, especially. And
Mhm.
frankly, I think they're the ones that are stepping up to the plate to really give Honda some competition. And
Yeah.
it's never really the competition that it should be. So,
Mhm. I absolutely agree with you. I think that they have uh they've always kind of marched to their own drummer.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
With like the I'm gonna butcher the name because I think I always get the Wankel engine. Is it the
Yeah.
Wankel engine? No,
Mhm.
Wankel. Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean those are the first ones I remember. And the engine had some issues. It it wasn't very durable. It got lousy gas mileage. But
Right.
the cars have 90% of the cars have been really nice to look at,
Yeah.
of their time, but certainly, uh, well designed for their time.
Sure. Sure.
Um, we've talked many times about the red that they sell and the new red that they
Mhm.
sell, just being gorgeous colors.
Sure. Sure.
But even your Mazda had just a beautiful red. I mean, I
Mhm.
totally remember that.
Fit and finish
Uh,
on that car for its class was exceptional. It really
yeah,
was. It was just
yeah.
it was such a well thought out, put together, roomy on the inside, light, and just, tons of fun to drive in a class that just should not have been any fun to drive at all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
um, everybody that sat in the car was automatically impressed. Mazda, you owe me a check, because back then when I got my car, two more people that I worked with went out and
Yeah.
bought the same,
Yeah.
went out and bought a Protege. And it was because they were like, wait, how much did you spend on this? And it's just, that was the thing about Mazda back then. And they've
Yeah.
had, they have had some hits. I mean, they are the people that came out with the Miata. And I remember
Yeah.
in the early 90s when that hit the market, that was a big freaking deal. And it was
That
because
was.
it just brought back the MGB. It brought back that,
Right.
that whole class of little convertible cars that Americans love. And good for them,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. There is. It's a Mazda by default, but you and I both own a Mazda pickup truck. It was the
Mhm.
same Mazda pickup truck, um, which was really a Ford Ranger, and
Right.
nothing against it. It just wasn't a truck that was had a lot of issues around this. I mean, I couldn't put the seat all the way back. It never went above 70. It was a regular cab, so it didn't have any kind of back seat, so you could either carry someone or stuff.
Yeah.
And you kind of had that choice,
Mhm.
But it
Yeah.
was a Ford. It was a Ford. It was fine. I'm sure the guy who bought it from me put many miles on it.
Right. It
Good
was,
for
yeah,
you.
it was a perfectly okay car.
Yeah.
But it was a Mazda by name only,
Right.
and
Right.
that showed.
Right.
And I was a little disappointed by that, to be honest with you. So,
My first choice is also going to be a car I owned, the Dodge Omni. And and while not a particularly exciting car, not not a it was built to the standard of the time, right? And but here's why I think it's underrated. I think it was the first step in saving Chrysler.
mhm,
It was the first, if not one of the first, front wheel drive American made cars.
mhm,
While its design and heritage goes back to European car, it was heavily redesigned and built in America, which other vehicles were not at that time. That would have been 78, 79. Um, I thought the design, it could just carry a whole bunch of stuff. Hatchback, seat down, just fill it up with all sorts of stuff, right? It really had a lot of room inside. Mine was a later one. It was 87, and it had the 2.2-liter engine, so it actually had some power. It was designed of the times, but I thought it was a decent looking car, and it laid the foundation for the K car, which most people say saved Chrysler.
right,
And I don't necessarily argue with that, but you wouldn't have had the K car without the Omni and Horizon
right.
to kind of put that first step in place. So I just look at it as a car that doesn't always get the credit that it should have
Mhm,
gotten at the time, and good, honest transportation. That's
right.
that's absolutely what it was, and yeah. So I that's my first pick.
Sure. I think that car suffered by comparison with the Volkswagen Rabbit. Um,
Yes.
and it was definitely, I mean, that's the niche that Chrysler was going after, but that wasn't a bad niche to be going after at the
No.
time. I mean, the
No.
Rabbit sort of set the bar for the small economy car in a very good way. I mean, another
Yeah.
light, pitchable, um,
Oh yeah.
not all that reliable. They had their share of issues,
Yeah.
but you know,
Yeah. We had we had the first one of the first rabbits that was built in Pennsylvania, the Westmoreland plant.
yeah.
Um, and pitchable is exactly the word for it. You could, you know,
Mhm. Yeah,
That was cool. It had power. It was it was a. I assume it was a four speed. I'm guessing it was a four speed at the time.
right.
Probably not a very powerful engine in today's standards, but that thing would whip along. That was a great car, and the driving dynamics were much different than the Omni. Right, the Omni was more American. Um, and the Volkswagen Rabbits became more American as the time went by
Right.
because they brought in, I think, GM folks to run the facility. And they said, well, what people really want is cushy ride and, big padded dash. Like, okay, fine,
Yeah.
whatever, whatever. But
Right.
yeah, yeah. All right, your turn.
My turn. Um, I think this car got a fair amount of recognition when it first came out, but I think it could have gotten more. The first generation Audi A4
Mm,
from
mm,
about, I'm going to say that was about the late 90s, early 2000s, um, was just in my mind such a well executed car. Um, affordable by Audi standards anyways. Just, definitely it was it was meant to be like their entry level into the luxury class sedan. I mean, they were kind of going after the BMW 3 Series, which is another benchmark kind of car,
mhm,
but they
mhm.
they took it in a styling direction that was just, it was very unique without being unsightly in any way, shape, or form. Just to this day, still a beautiful car. You see one
Mhm.
of these older on the road and it's almost like you could just clean it up, polish it, and still sell it as a new car, and it wouldn't look outdated.
And also set the styling example for the A6, the
Right.
A8, that
Absolutely.
entire range of cars works off of
Absolutely.
that first style.
Right. And the first generation A6 was just as gorgeous. And then the first generation A8 was a little bit more sedan-like and a little bit more formal and still a gorgeous car. And I just thought
Oh,
that was when Audi was kind of in their prime. They're a great automaker. I mean, I've owned one myself. Uh, it's quirky German mechanics in many ways, shapes, and forms. But that car was just, I think, just a solid hit.
mhm.
And it got good reviews, and I think it got plenty of attention, and its sales were probably very good. But I think just in my mind, one of those cars that really ticked so many boxes and stood out for me. I mean, back then I could not have afforded one, and it was a
Right,
dream car for me.
right.
Um, and it's funny because a good friend of mine ended up buying one, and I was like, I hate you, and I will never speak to you ever again. He got it in that gorgeous dark royal blue, and it was just what a
Oh,
beautiful car. So good for him.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um, and I think in a lot of ways, when I see the current A3, I think
yeah,
I think exactly the first A4s, you
absolutely,
know,
absolutely. It's
and I
it's a,
think I
it's
think
just a
it's
hair
close in
smaller.
size,
Yeah, yep.
but
Yeah, the current A3 is about the size of that old A4, a little bit smaller. But yeah, I can't help but think like somebody said, hey, let's do some styling cues all the way back to that. Why not? And
yeah,
sharp, sharp little car.
yeah,
Excellent.
exactly. All right, my next one, the Ford Flex.
Mm,
Um, I think it was a car that was 10 years ahead of its time. I honestly do. I think that you could have that out there with the Land Rover, um, or the new Hyundai Santa Fe. That same boxy.
sure.
Not a fan of the strakes down the side. I don't know what you call them, but the things down
Yeah.
the side. Were they on the side or the hood? Well, in any case, there was it went the entire length of the body panel, and I just thought it was supremely practical.
Yeah.
And again, uh, here's an interesting fact about them: that they sold like crazy in California. Like they had better sales numbers in California than they did anywhere else in the country,
Hmm.
and which I thought was always an interesting nugget of information. Um, but decent design, not shouty. There was one it's that sort of cinnamon color, like
Mhm.
a dark chestnut brown maybe, and the white roof, which I'm not a normal fan of the white roof
Right.
thing, but just I thought that was a cool car.
I'm gonna go to an old standby.
Okay,
Don't hate me for this. The Ford Capri from Europe that was brought
okay,
over here under the Mercury tag was a
yep,
superior car. It really
yep,
was. Uh, Again, another one of these light, pitchable, fun to drive, frugal, but still relatively
hmm,
fast for its day and age. I was enamored of the styling of it, although now it has some cues on it that wouldn't
yeah.
necessarily fly, but back then, absolutely.
Well, it was a great
Um,
looking car.
it really was. It really was. It was just, this cool looking two-door sedan. They sold fairly well, I guess, but it wasn't,
Yeah,
it wasn't revolutionary. It was for me because it was my first car crush, so I can't help but think that, it was an underrated car. I drove a much older one years later, standard shift, and even though it was an old car and it didn't have much life left in it, it was still fun to drive. I tell you.
uh-huh,
I mean, it was very old at that point, but because I mean, we're talking that these cars were released. The heyday was 72 and 73.
right,
It was the
right.
big, model for that. And I wasn't driving until like 80. So, it was going to be at least going on a decade old. And that was pretty old for a car back then. But yeah, more German engineering that I absolutely loved. So,
Here's what when I think of the Capri, I think of Moriarty Brothers, which was the Lincoln Mercury dealership in
sure.
here in Manchester, and in that era, you'd have the Marquis and the Montego, and then there'd
Mhm.
be this Capri sitting there, and a Comet, and then a Di Tommaso Pantera,
Right.
because like Mercury was the like, well, we'll put all these cars in that pile, right?
Right.
Because we don't
Right.
have enough room in the Ford showroom, so we'll just put them in the Mercury showroom. And
Right.
it was just this, going from a Lincoln Continental to the Di Tommaso Pantera to the Capri, to, it was just, what are you thinking? And and is it a surprise that Mercury had a chaotic brand image or no
Yeah.
brand image at all when you
Right.
deal with it
Right.
like that? But the Cougar, that's another one. The Cougar,
Cougar was another one,
whatever.
right?
Right.
Right.
Um, that leads me to my underrated, and I think the first generation Cougar. I
Sure.
have,
Yep.
uh, you know, for years and years, I thought, it's a really nice Mustang, which it is, but I never realized that it was longer than the Mustang.
Yeah.
That
Mm.
that it had more and it had that sort of Gran Turismo feel of elegance and speed.
Yeah.
And I think that, it didn't it when you think of that era of cars, and you immediately think of the Mustang, the Camaro, the Challengers, and people skip over the Cougar when it had the XR7, what had a big engine, right?
Mhm.
And it's not the first gen. I think it's the second gen that's in the James Bond film, right? Where it goes skating across the
Yes.
ice.
Yep.
Um, and which I saw that actual car in an exhibit of James Bond cars last year. That was pretty cool. But yeah, so the that first generation, and to some degree the second generation as well. So that from 67 to you know 71 or so. I really like those. I really like
Yeah.
those. Your
Good
turn.
choice. Um, I'm kind of doubling back on Mazda, but it's a two-pronged. The mid-90s Ford Probe slash Mazda
Hmm.
uh Mazda 6, was it? No.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
was it the 6? Did they call it the 6? The swoopy? I
Yeah.
was gonna say it's the 6, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Either way, the cousin to the Ford Probe, they were made side by side because Ford and Mazda were one company at that point, or Ford had an ownership stake in Mazda, which
Right.
they actually
Yeah.
sold off. But I'm convinced that the Ford Probe didn't do well because Probe is it's not a great name for a car. Okay. It's just not a great word. It just, how's your probe?
Right. Right. It's
Ow.
like it's like moist. People's
Yes, yes, thank you. Yes. With apologies to my daughter-in-law, she hates that word, and I'm like, yeah, all right, I get it, I get it. And yeah, it just that was, I mean, and I know we're putting an awful lot on a name, but honestly, I remember back then, gorgeous car. I didn't want to tell people, yeah, my probe is in the shop, just ugh, ah. But
but it
um,
sold well. It
but
sold well.
did it sell well?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Um,
it wasn't like crazy, but it sold well. Yeah.
right.
But the Mazda, that Mazda 6 Coupe is beautiful.
It is. It is.
Beautiful. One of the ads they had for it, and I maybe I'll find it, maybe I won't. They showed them putting one in like a glass bottle and storing
Yeah.
it. And talked
Right.
about in X number of years, you're going to want to have this, this car is still going to look as beautiful. And they're right, because that
Hmm.
beautiful car
Yep.
had an Opel Calibri vibe to it.
Yep. Hmm.
Just a outstanding car.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a win.
Right.
Yeah.
And and the Pro looked different, but I thought it was still a very, very attractive car in a different way. It was just,
Mhm.
and good for them for making the two different. If I had the money back then, I was going to buy the Mazda, but that was primarily because I was coming off of owning a Mazda, which did
Yeah.
well by me.
Yeah.
But so more props to Mazda, but yeah, just and they didn't last for very long, and I guess their sales were good, but didn't really make a splash. I wish it had. I don't think the driving dynamics were all that insanely sporty, which
Mhm.
led a lot of people to think that it was a sheep in wolf's clothing. But who cares? Gorgeous car, gorgeous car.
I think it also suffered from the fact that that two-door coupe style as a class of cars, and there were a lot of them,
Hmm.
that was like the tail end of it.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that market was going away,
yeah,
much
for
like
sure.
the Grand Prix or the Buick Regal or Cutlass Supreme, that kind of personal,
Yeah,
larger personal coupe. Just
right.
uh, you know,
Yeah. Well, people recognize that they want more utility out of their car, and that ushered in the SUV age, which we are in the thick of now, for sure.
um, okay. Uh, Programming note. I have one more.
Go ahead.
Um, okay. Uh, the Ford Freestyle. It was sort of a tourist wagon,
Right,
but I always thought the design was really nice. It's the same platform as the Flex, so I'm not going that far.
right.
But I just thought it had a really that um a lot of the Ford designs from the mid 2000s,
Hmm.
I think were really sharp designs. Uh, it's the 500 in that era. It wasn't a
Right.
Taurus, but some of them I didn't like, some of them I did. But that's
Hmm.
that freestyle, which was essentially a Taurus wagon, and later they called
Right.
it a Taurus X wagon. But yeah, I like that. I thought that was a cool looking car. Um,
Hmm.
you know, uh, Typical, you know, family mobile. Probably not as probably in the same vein as the Volvo wagons are now, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
people aren't buying that many wagons in the world, and you know,
Yep.
it is sad. We have an episode about that, folks.
Yes, we do. Just they like wagons, they just like them in that higher format is
Right.
what it comes down to. And
Right.
we can't really blame them. There's something nice about the driving position of an SUV that a wagon doesn't necessarily have, but I do kind of miss the wagon class.
All right. This has been another episode of Car-Pinionated. Jeff will join us again.
You will.
He will.
We'll track him down.
What?
We'll track him down.
Yeah.
We'll hunt him down.
The wilds of Chicago.
Right, exactly.
And remember a couple things, folks. Send in your cars that you feel are underrated and no one loves as much as you. And send those to dstewart at fox61.com. Like and subscribe on YouTube. It helps us out, helps the little algorithm. I'll put it up. I'll put it on Glenn's side this time because he just pointed there.
Okay.
All right. And that's it for this week. We will see you again. Good night, everyone.